A 12-year-old girl found her real father on a plane. What he whispered made her cry. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near first class, let alone kneeling beside a man who was losing his life 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. But there she was, 12-year-old Amara, trembling hands pressed to the chest of a stranger with fading breath, sweat pooling on her forehead, her voice shaking as she whispered, "Don't you die on me." His pulse was slipping. The oxygen mask above him swung like a pendulum, mocking the order of a world that had just fractured. Around them, chaos erupted. Screams, gasps, prayers shouted into turbulence. But inside her mind, everything narrowed to the gray-blue color draining from his face and the photograph she had seen hours earlier. The one that changed everything. Before we go further, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful, emotional stories based on true events and deep human connections. Turn on the bell so you never miss a moment that might change how you see the world. Now back to that flight. It wasn't the turbulence that terrified Amara, it was the silence. The kind that comes after something snaps. Thomas Blake, a man whose face had been all over business magazines, but whose eyes showed no warmth, had collapsed across 3 seats in row 1A. No one expected the girl in row 23F to suddenly sprint up the aisle, leap over a service card, and start CPR like her own life depended on it. But Amara didn't think. She just moved. Instinct had taken over before fear had the chance to grab hold. Her palms ached from the compressions. Her arms were too small for the task, her frame too light to deliver the full weight CPR required, but she pressed harder, desperate to keep him tethered to this world. The flight attendants froze for a beat too long. Businessmen clutched their phones. Women sobbed into designer scarves. But Amara was locked in. Her breath matched the rhythm of her pushing. 1, 2, 3, 4, breathe. 1, 2, 3, don't stop. She didn't stop. Not even when she saw the small photograph crumpled in his lap. A younger version of her. Yes, her. Wearing a yellow dress she barely remembered, standing beside a woman whose face was mostly shadow. She didn't even know how the picture ended up there. She didn't have time to ask. But her heart thudded with the kind of fear that no child should ever have to carry. Why does this stranger have a photo of me? And then he moved. His hand twitched, his eyelids fluttered, and through a mask that hung loose and useless at his jaw, he whispered something so raw, so impossible, it cut through the noise like a blade. "My daughter." Amara's world tilted. Not from the plane's sharp drop, not from exhaustion, but from the unbearable weight of 2 simple words. Amara didn't respond. Not with words. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Just the trembling breath of a girl whose entire reality had cracked open in a single heartbeat. "My daughter." He said like he meant it. Like he knew. Like he'd waited years to say it. Only to have it slip out between gasps of failing breath and the blare cabin alarms. "Sir, we need you to stay still," one of the flight attendants orders sharply, stepping in to adjust the mask, but Thomas Blake didn't let go of Amara's wrist. His grip was surprisingly firm. Not painful, but urgent pleading. His eyes locked with hers, darker now, dilated, clouded with panic and something else. Regret? Recognition? Fear? She stared back, her hand frozen midair. The photograph was still on the floor, half-tucked beneath the hem of his coat. Her photo. There was no denying it. No coincidence. No mistake. He had been watching her, somehow, long before this flight. She should have pulled away. Should have asked questions, demanded answers, screamed even. But her voice had buried itself somewhere too deep. Her mind tried to catch up. Is he lying? Hallucinating? Could he really be? Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're making an emergency descent due to a medical issue in the forward cabin. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Crew, prepare for landing." The plane dropped again. A sickening dip that made several passengers scream outright. But Amara didn't flinch. She barely noticed. Her focus was locked on the man beside her and the word he'd just used. Daughter. It didn't make sense. He wasn't her father. Her father had died when she was 4. She remembered his voice only through bedtime stories her grandmother told. She remembered peppermint. Motor oil. A laugh that vibrated through her ribs when he picked her up. He was long gone. Dead. Buried. So who was this? Thomas Blake groaned, body shuddering as the turbulence tossed the cabin like a toy boat. The medical equipment they'd brought from the rear storage beeped wildly. Someone shouted, "He's crashing," and Amara was yanked backward, away from him, as paramedics rushed forward, bursting through the curtain from the galley. She stood there in the aisle, surrounded by chaos, still clutching the photo in one hand, the edges damp from her sweat. Her other hand felt ghostly, his touch still imprinted on her wrist. She didn't realize she was crying until a tear hit the collar of her t-shirt. The paramedics worked fast. Fluid bags, oxygen compressions again, this time with adult strength. They lifted him onto a stretcher as the plane touched down hard, skidding against the runway at a remote airport Amara had never heard of. The shock of the landing jolted the cabin, but did nothing to jolt her out of what was happening inside her head. He had called her his daughter. The voice of a stranger. The face of a millionaire. The photo of her. And a whisper that would change everything. As the passengers slowly disembarked in tense silence, Amara moved like someone underwater. Each step felt disconnected from the next. The roar of the engines had quieted, but inside her, the noise was only just beginning. Something had happened up there. Something that went far beyond medical emergencies and oxygen masks. IT wasn't just a man she had helped save. That IT was a secret, that a question, a door into a past no one ever prepared her to face. They told her to wait in the terminal lounge, away from the stretchers, the sirens, and the chaos. A kind-looking attendant handed her a juice box and gestured toward the rows of empty chairs. But Amara couldn't sit still. Her legs wouldn't stop shaking. Her hand clenched the photo she'd picked up before they carried him out. She hadn't meant to take it. She just couldn't leave it behind. It was her. 4 years old, braids messy, front tooth missing, standing on someone's front porch with her small arms wrapped around a woman she barely remembered. Her mother, probably. But it was her own face in the photo that kept messing with her. She hadn't seen that picture in years, if ever. And now it had fallen out of a dying man's coat pocket. A man who whispered, "My daughter," while fighting for air. None of it made sense. That's what scared her most. Amara had been raised to be logical, to ask questions, not jump to conclusions. Her grandma, Mimi, everyone called her that, used to say, "Your mind is your compass, baby. When you get lost in your feelings, stop. Use your brain." But even her brain was short-circuiting now. Who was that man? How did he have this photo? Why did he look at her like he knew everything? The nurse who checked on her said they'd landed in Gander, Newfoundland, a place Amara had never heard of, never planned to visit. And yet here she was, in a winter coat too big for her body, gripping a photo like it might evaporate if she blinked too hard. She should have called Mimi. Should have asked for help. But the last time they spoke, just before the flight, Mimi had told her to read the letter only if something strange happened. Amara thought it was just another one of her grandma's odd habits. She talked to ghosts sometimes, said prayers in languages Amara didn't understand. But now, something strange felt like an understatement. She reached into the side pocket of her backpack, pulled out the folded paper Mimi had slipped her before they left for the airport. "You might never need this," Mimi had whispered. "But if you do, I need you to read it with your whole heart, not your head," which was odd advice, coming from a woman who worshipped logic. The letter was short, just a page. Her grandma's handwriting was always neat, but here it looked nervous, rushed, like she wrote in one sitting, heart pounding. "If you're reading this, something's come up. I always knew it might. The man you met, or are about to meet, is not a stranger, not to me, and not to your mama. His name is Thomas Blake. You probably know him from somewhere. TV, newspapers, who knows. He's a powerful man. Cold, but not cruel. Distant, but not evil. The kind of man who makes hard choices and then forgets how to live with them. He doesn't know you the way I do, but he's watched over you in his own way. Whether that counts for anything, I leave for you to decide." Amara stopped reading. Her hand tightened around the paper. The name, Thomas Blake, slammed into her like a train. She didn't know it. She remembered from a business magazine Mimi once used to prop up a wobbly table leg. Billionaire tech investor. Real estate magnate. Quiet reclusive. No scandals. No family listed. No family, except maybe one. She didn't cry. Not yet. The tears were somewhere in her chest, still deciding if they had permission. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it away with the photo, and sat back against the wall. Her mind went straight to her dad. Not this new man with his expensive coat and private jet energy. Her real dad. The one who used to lift her onto his shoulders and call her champ. His name was James. James Weaver. He died in a car accident when she was 4, and every memory of him felt like something filtered through mist. She remembered smells more than words. Peppermint gum. The scent of old engine grease. The way his laughter felt like thunder in a soft sky. Mimi always said he was a good man. A solid man. And now this other man, this stranger, was walking into her life holding secrets wrapped in silk. Why now? Amara wondered. Why here? Why me? She didn't believe in fate. But something about that flight, about the storm, the turbulence, the timing, felt almost scripted, like the universe was pushing her toward a chapter she didn't ask for. And somehow, she knew the photo wasn't the end of anything, that it was the beginning. That she didn't sleep that night. Not even a little. The emergency hotel was quiet, a kind of eerie quiet, like everyone else was holding their breath the same way she was. She stayed curled up on the edge of the bed, still wearing her shoes, staring at the photograph under the dim glow of the lamp. Her 4-year-old self stared back, frozen in time. It wasn't just the image that bothered her. It was the way it felt like it had been stolen, like someone had taken a piece of her life and kept it hidden. Amara wanted to scream at it, tear it up, throw it away. But she couldn't. That photo meant someone had been watching her. And worse, that maybe everyone else had known but her. Mimi had always been her constant, her ground. She never lied. Not outright, but she also never told the whole truth. It's not about what you say, Mimi once said. It's what you don't say that counts. And now Amara realized just how much hadn't been said. The next morning, there was a knock on the door. A hotel staff member handed her a phone. Old school, cordless, heavy, and said, "He's awake. He's asking for you." Her hand froze. Her chest tightened. She didn't know if it was fear or fury. Maybe both. She took the phone anyway. "Hello." His voice was soft, scratchy, barely above a whisper. "Amara." She didn't respond. Didn't know how to. Hearing her name like that, from him, felt invasive. Like he was reaching into a life he had no right to touch. "I'm not going to ask if you believe me," he said. "I know I have no claim. But I needed to say it. I needed to tell you before I couldn't." She gripped the phone tighter. "How do you have that photo?" she asked, low and flat. A pause. "Your mother sent it to me. Years ago. Before she disappeared." That word. Disappeared. It cracked something inside her. Disappeared how? Amara's voice trembled despite how hard she fought it. "You mean left?" "She left me. She was sick," he said. "Not like flu sick. The kind that gets into your mind. The kind that makes you forget who you are and who you're hurting." Amara felt her pulse climbing, heat rushing to her face. She'd spent most of her life pretending not to care about her mother. It was easier that way. Cleaner. She told herself the woman was gone, and that was that. But now she was hearing words that didn't match the story she had told herself. And it scared her more than anything. Thomas's voice cracked again. "Your mother didn't abandon you. She protected you. She left so you wouldn't see her unravel." Silence. Amara couldn't speak. Her fingers wrapped tighter around the receiver. "I didn't know she was pregnant," he continued. "Not until after she left. By the time I found out, your father had already." He stopped, breath catching. "James was a good man. Better than I ever was. She made the right call choosing him." Amara shut her eyes. His words twisted her stomach. It sounded like the truth, but the truth still hurt. "So what now?" she asked. "You tell me all this, and then what? I go back to pretending nothing happened." "No, I don't want that," he said quietly. "But I won't force anything. Whatever you decide, I'll respect. You don't owe me anything. I just didn't want to leave this world without telling you who you are. Who you've always been." Another long pause. Amara looked down at the photograph again, her younger self frozen in joy she no longer remembered. He broke the silence once more. "There's a letter. From your mother. I've kept it. If you want it, it's yours. She didn't answer right away. She wasn't ready to say yes, but she wasn't ready to say no either. She handed the phone back to the staff member and walked to the window. Snow was falling now, light and aimless, like no one had told it where to go. Somewhere below, ambulances were still parked beside the plane. Somewhere else, strangers were resuming their lives. But Amara wasn't going back to hers. Not the one she thought she knew. Because this wasn't just about a photo. This was about everything that came before it, and everything it had broken. The plane had landed, but the storm hadn't passed. Not the one inside Amara. Everything around her was moving. Passengers rushing through the jet bridge, flight attendants directing people toward exits, the cold air leaking in through the open door. But she stood still, rooted in a silence that felt louder than the emergency sirens. They were transferring him onto the stretcher. Thomas Blake, the man whose eyes had been cold and dismissive when she first saw him, now barely able to keep those same eyes open. His face was pale, sickly, older somehow. But the moment he saw her standing at the edge of the aisle, something shifted. His hand reached for her. It was weak, trembling, but deliberate. The paramedics didn't stop him. Maybe they sensed this wasn't just a random moment between a sick man and a curious child. She stepped forward, hesitantly. It felt like walking into a memory she didn't have yet. Their eyes met again, this time without the walls. No arrogance, no status, no distance. Just two people tethered by something neither fully understood. His fingers closed around hers. Not tightly, not with force, just enough to be felt. I should have come sooner, he whispered. For words. That's all it took. Her chest broke open. Not because she understood everything. She didn't. Not even close. But in those 4 words there was weight. Guilt. Shame. And something closer to love than anything he'd let show before. She didn't want to cry. She really didn't. But her body betrayed her. One tear, then another. No sobs. No dramatic gasp. Just a quiet flood she couldn't stop. She wasn't sure what hurt more, that he hadn't come sooner, or that part of her wanted him to mean it. The medics began to wheel him away. His hand slipped from hers. No bombis. No promises. Just that sentence, hanging in the air like the last note of the song that ended too early. She stood there long after he was gone, her hand still slightly open, fingers tingling where his had been. Later, at the makeshift terminal set up for diverted passengers, Amara sat with her backpack on her lap, the photo and letter inside. A few rows down, people talked about misconnections, hotel vouchers, insurance claims. But none of that mattered to her. What mattered was that for the first time, she couldn't tell who she was mad at. Him, for being gone. Her mother, for disappearing. Mimi, for hiding the truth. Or herself, for wanting any of them to explain something that might never be explained. She kept replaying the moment over and over. His face when he said it. The way his voice cracked. That look in his eyes, like he'd spent years carrying something too heavy, and she had unknowingly helped him set it down. But that's the thing about burdens. You can't just give them away. She'd picked it up the moment he let go, and now it was hers. The storm stayed with her long after the plane, the stretcher, and the chaos had faded into silence. Amara didn't know how long she sat there, hunched forward in that stiff plastic airport chair, her arms wrapped around her backpack like it might keep her from unraveling. She didn't want to talk. Not to the airline rep who offered her water, not to the kind older couple who tried to make small talk, and definitely not to the woman from the embassy who offered to escort her to a more comfortable waiting area. Everyone's voice felt too loud, too polite, too far removed from what had just happened. Nobody knew what it meant to have a man call you his daughter and then vanish behind a curtain of medical urgency before you could say a word back. She pulled out the letter again. Mimi's handwriting was steady, full of calm authority, but Amara now read it with new eyes. She caught things she hadn't noticed before. Phrases like he's watched over you in his own way, and your mother trusted him once. That last word stuck with her once. Past tense. What had changed? What broke that trust? Amara had questions she didn't even know how to form. But one thing was clear now. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. That man knew exactly who she was. When she was finally alone in the quiet guest lounge a few hours later, she took out her phone and searched his name, Thomas Blake. Hundreds of results. Articles, interviews, company press releases. Billionaire investor, philanthropist, reclusive. No mention of family. No mention of her. No mention of anything even close to personal. His image popped up on screen. Sharp suits, sterile smiles, handshakes with politicians, and Amara felt the same coldness she'd seen on the plane. But now it was tinted with something more, distance, pain, maybe even remorse. She scrolled until she found a profile piece from 5 years ago, back when he'd donated $20 million to a children's hospital. The journalist had tried to dig into his personal life, but hit a wall. The article quoted someone calling him a man who lives behind locked doors, even when they're wide open. Amara didn't know what that meant then. Now she did. She closed the tab and pulled the photo back out. This time, she looked at it differently. Not just at herself, but at the details, the porch, the woman beside her, the sliver of handwriting on the back corner. E+A/13. The A was clearly her, which meant E had to be Eliza, her mother. And if this photo was dated 2013, it was taken a year before Eliza disappeared. She didn't want to believe that her mother would have sent this to Thomas willingly. But why else would he have it? Why else would Mimi write that letter, warning her that something might come up? Unless everyone knew. Unless the secrets had been there all along, hiding in the spaces between the things they didn't say. It wasn't just the fact that Thomas might be her biological father. That would have been huge enough. It was the realization that people she loved, people she trusted, had decided not to tell her, had chosen to keep that part of her locked away. She didn't know if she hated them for it, but she definitely didn't forgive them. Not yet. Somewhere outside the glass, a new plane touched down. Somewhere in a hospital nearby, Thomas Blake was alive, maybe recovering, maybe not. And somewhere, in a city she'd never been to, was a box full of truth she hadn't opened yet. She knew she couldn't turn back, couldn't return to her old life pretending this hadn't happened. There was no version of her childhood, of her identity, that wasn't cracked now. The storm had moved inside her, but maybe that was where the clearing would begin. The hotel room was quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that made your thoughts feel louder, heavier. Amara sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her coat, her backpack at her feet, and the sealed envelope in her hands. Her name was written across the front in blue ink, Amara Eliza Weaver. Her full name, the one almost no one used. Except her mother. A mother she hadn't seen in 5 years. A mother she thought had chosen to walk away. She stared at the envelope for a long time. Part of her wanted to tear it open and devour every word, desperate for answers. The other part wanted to throw it across the room and never look at it again. Because once she opened it, she couldn't go back to not knowing. And somehow, that was scarier than the not knowing itself. Mr. Elliot had dropped it off without much explanation. Just a firm, polite British smile and a line she couldn't stop hearing in her head. Your mother wrote this for you, in case you ever came looking. But Amara hadn't come looking. Not really. She got thrown into this. Thrown into a flight, a storm, a stranger's arms, a truth no one had prepared her to carry. And now she had this letter. This delicate piece of paper with the power to burn holes in everything she'd built to protect herself. She opened it. The handwriting was soft, careful, like someone who didn't trust their hands to do what their heart needed them to. The first line stopped her cold. I was sick when I left, Amara. Not the kind you can see. Not the kind you get medicine for at CVS and sleep off. I was sick in a way that made me scared of myself. Her throat tightened. She didn't expect it to hit that fast. She kept reading. I know you probably hate me. Or worse, you don't care. I've imagined both, and they hurt the same. The truth is I didn't want to leave you. I had to. I was losing control of my mind, my memories, my sense of reality. Some days I didn't know who I was, where I was. Some days I thought the world was trying to hurt you, and I was the only one who could stop it. Other days I thought I was the danger. Amara had no memory of those days. She only remembered her mother being there, then not. There were no goodbyes, no explanations, just the empty space where love used to be. She kept reading, even though her chest felt tighter with every word. I left you with Mimi because I knew she would protect you from me. I didn't trust myself to do that anymore. That's not an excuse. It's not forgiveness I'm asking for. It's just truth. Something I never gave you. Truth. That word again. The one everyone seemed to think was a gift, like honesty could fix everything it had broken. But Amara knew better. Truth was a blade, and no matter how carefully you held it, someone always bled. She reached the end of the letter slowly, like dragging herself across ice. I hope one day you can understand. And if not, I hope you can still live. Live big, loud, free. Not in my shadow. Not in anyone's. Just you. I love you, even from far away. Mom. No signature. Just that one word, Mom. And somehow that hurt more than anything else. Because for 5 years, Amara had told herself she didn't have a mother. That whatever came before had ended. But now she knew her mother had never stopped loving her. She just couldn't stay. She folded the letter carefully, like it might fall apart in her hands. Then she sat back and let the weight of it settle. She didn't cry this time. Not because she wasn't sad, but because sadness didn't quite cover it. It was more complicated. A kind of grief that didn't know where to land. She didn't know if she forgave her mother. She didn't even know if she wanted to. But what she did know, without question, was that something in her had shifted. Because now, for the first time, she saw the past, not as something done to her, but something she had survived. She didn't know how long she sat there before the knock came. Soft, deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side already understood this wasn't a door you barged through. Amara opened it to find Mr. Elliot standing there again. Same charcoal gray suit, same polite smile, but his eyes seemed different this time. Gentler, maybe. He didn't ask how she was doing. He didn't offer tea or use the kind of voice adults use when they think kids are too fragile for honesty. He just nodded toward the letter in her hand. She loved you, you know, he said, even when she was too far gone to show it. Amara didn't respond. Not right away, because part of her wanted to scream at him, at everyone, for not telling her sooner, for letting her grow up with a hole in her chest that had no name. But another part, the quieter, more exhausted part, knew it wouldn't change anything. So instead she asked, "Did you know her?" Elliot nodded. Briefly. "I met her once, before you were born. She was brilliant, intense, and tired. Very, very tired." That tracked with the voice in the letter. Strong, but fraying at the edges. He gestured toward the elevator. "Thomas wants to see you. When you're ready." The name made her stomach twist. She still didn't know what to call him. Not Dad. That word still belonged to James. Not really Thomas, either. It felt too formal, too distant for someone who had whispered my daughter as he fell unconscious. She didn't answer Elliot's invitation, just grabbed her coat and followed him. They walked in silence through the quiet halls of the hotel until they reached a small private conference room, the kind usually reserved for business meetings and overpriced coffee. A leather folder sat on the table. Elliot motioned for her to sit, then opened it gently. Inside was a key, a photo, a scanned letter. He slid them across to her like they were evidence in a case only she could solve. "This," he said, tapping the key, "is to Thomas's personal deposit box. He's kept it untouched for years. Everything inside belongs to you now." She stared at it, unsure of what to feel. She hadn't even spoken to Thomas again since the phone call. Part of her wondered if she even wanted to. But another part, the same part that didn't throw away the first photo, leaned forward. The second photo was older, black and white. A woman, her mother, young, smiling, leaning against a fence post. Pregnant, hand resting on her belly. There was something in her eyes that Amara couldn't look away from. Hope, fear, something suspended between those two things. "She sent him that picture," Elliot said softly, along with a letter he never showed anyone. Until now, Amara picked up the letter. The handwriting wasn't her mother's, it was his. Thomas's. Short, precise, like someone used to writing reports, not feelings. But the first sentence dropped like a stone. "I want to be the kind of man who could stay." I wasn't. That was it. No grand confession. No elaborate story. Just one line of truth that rang too familiar. People were always leaving. Amara folded the paper slowly, placed it next to the first letter, and sat back in the chair. She didn't know what came next. Didn't know if she wanted to see him, or scream at him, or sit in the same room and say nothing at all. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, it would be her choice. Not his, not Mimi's, not anyone's. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. The office was colder than she expected, not physically, but in a way that made Amara straighten her back without thinking. Mr. Elliot held the door for her without saying much. She stepped inside, and there was on the table a dark metal box, slightly dented at one corner, its key already in the lock. No guards, no ceremony, just a box that had waited in silence, year after year, like it knew this day would come. Elliot didn't sit down. He just nodded once and stepped back, giving her space. Amara reached for the key. Her hand hesitated. She wasn't ready, but she was never going to be ready. She turned it. The lock clicked softly. She lifted the lid. Inside, everything was labeled. Neatly, carefully, like someone had packed away the most fragile parts of their soul and couldn't risk forgetting where they left them. On top was a folder, her name again, written in block letters. Underneath were photos, school pictures, grainy cell phone shots from a distance, clippings from the local paper where her name showed up in spelling bee announcements or science fair wins. It wasn't just a box. It was a shrine. Not the loud kind, with candles and flowers. The quiet kind, built by someone who couldn't say her name out loud, but never stopped watching. She flipped through the items slowly. A wristband from the hospital where she was born. A page torn from a children's book, with the corner folded like someone had stopped there years ago and couldn't go on. Letters, unsent, dated across a decade. Each one started with Amara and ended with his name. His real name, Dad. She had to stop. Her chest burned. Her hands shook. He had written her letters for birthdays, for holidays, for milestones she never knew he knew about. I saw your 5th grade presentation. You were brilliant. I heard you won a math award. I always hated math. You must get that from Eliza. I missed your 12th birthday, but I baked a cake anyway. It stayed in my fridge for 3 days before I threw it out. Amara swallowed hard. Her mouth it was too much, too personal, too late. Mr. Elliot finally spoke from the corner of the room. He never stopped trying to find a way back in. But he wasn't just up against your grandmother. His own family didn't want it known either. She looked up. Why? Elliot took a breath. Because Thomas Blake wasn't just a man. He was a brand. A billionaire. A board chairman. The face of integrity. And in his world, a child with an unmarried, unstable woman would have ended everything. His parents threatened legal action. Shareholders warned him it would tank acquisitions. Every lawyer told him to walk away. So he did. Elliot paused. But he didn't stay gone. Not really. Amara's eyes dropped back to the letters. She believed it. Not because of what he said, but because of what he saved. The man on the plane wasn't the same man as the one in those letters. One looked like he didn't care. The other looked like he never forgave himself for not showing it. She found one last envelope in the bottom of the box. Different handwriting. Her mother's. Short note. A single line. If you love her, don't disappear. Even if you can't stay. Amara folded the letter carefully and closed the lid. Not because it was over, because it wasn't. But now, she had something to stand on. Truth. Not whole, not perfect, but enough. The meeting wasn't in a hospital room. That part surprised her. She expected wires, machines, maybe even a nurse hovering close by, but instead they met in a private recovery suite in the same hotel. Mr. Elliot knocked once, then opened the door, and Amara walked in before she could talk herself out of it. Thomas was sitting in an armchair near the window, thinner than she remembered, pale but alert. His eyes met hers instantly. No flicker, no hesitation. Like he'd been staring at the door for hours, hoping she'd walk through it. He didn't stand up. She didn't expect him to. She stayed near the door, arms crossed, backpack still on her shoulders. I didn't think you'd come, he said quietly. She didn't answer that. Instead, she pulled out the photo from the deposit box and dropped it on the table between them. You kept this, she said, her voice sharp, not soft. You kept all of it. Letters, school pictures, a lock of my baby hair. That's not nothing. Thomas looked at the photo, but didn't touch it. His hand stayed on the armrests, like he knew he didn't have permission. I didn't come here, so you could explain yourself. Amara continued. I came to hear the truth. All of it. Not the cleaned-up version. Not the PR answer. Thomas nodded once. Okay. She sat down across from him, but not close. She didn't lean in, didn't relax, just waited. He didn't look away. When your mother told me she was pregnant, it was too late. I was already under scrutiny, new contracts, board votes, investor meetings. I thought I could fix it quietly, set up support, stay distant. But Eliza refused. She said if I wouldn't claim you, I wouldn't get to shape you. And she was right. She was always braver than I was. Amara didn't blink, so you let her walk away. You let her carry it alone. Yes, he said, with no defense in his tone. And I hated myself for it. She let the silence stretch. You said on the plane, my daughter. Not I'm your father. Not I think you're mine. You said it like it was a fact. Because it is, he replied. Because from the moment I knew you existed, I've carried you around in my head every day. I didn't always know what to do with that. I didn't always do the right thing. But I never once forgot. Her throat tightened, but she kept it hidden. Then why didn't you come back? I tried, he said softly. I wrote letters. I left messages. Mimi never returned them. I offered legal mediation. But I also knew what I represented. Money, risk, instability. I gave her reasons to shut the door. She did what she thought was best. Amara looked at him, searching. Did you love my mother? He didn't flinch. Yes, but I loved myself more back then. That's the part one regret. It wasn't the words that moved her. It was the way he said them, like a man who knew he'd lost the right to be forgiven, but showed up anyway. She sat back in her chair. She didn't know if she trusted him. She didn't know if she ever could. But she knew he wasn't lying, and that was something. I'm not ready to call you anything, she said. Not yet. I don't expect you to. But I need you to understand something, she said, voice steady now. If you want to be part of this life, mine, you don't get to disappear again. You don't get to love me from a distance. If you're in, you're in. Thomas nodded once, almost like he was making a vow. I'm in. She stood. Then we'll see. And just like that, she walked out. Not because she didn't care, but because she finally did. The call wasn't planned. It happened in that strange middle place between clarity and collapse, when you know the truth, but it still hasn't made peace with you. Amara sat on the edge of the hotel bed, phone in her hand, thumb hovering over the number Mr. Elliot had programmed earlier that morning. She'd stared at it all day. Opened the contact, closed it, opened it again. There were no scripts for this conversation, no guidebook for calling a man you barely knew and asking him why he chose silence over presence. But at some point, fear just gave way to the need to know. So she pressed call. The line rang once, twice. Then his voice, Amara. He said her name like it was fragile, like it might break if he said it too loud. She didn't answer at first. She could hear him breathing on the other end. Waiting, finally, she spoke. I'm not calling because I forgive you. I know. I'm not calling because I miss you. I wouldn't expect that. I'm calling because I have questions. And I want answers. All of them. No half-truths. There was a pause. He didn't argue. Ask. And so she did. She asked about her mother. About how it started. About how it ended. About whether he ever truly planned to come back. She asked if he sent money, or help, or anything more than guilt wrapped in silence. He answered each one, not defensively, not dramatically, just honestly. Sometimes his voice cracked. Sometimes hers did. At one point, she almost hung up, but something in his voice, raw, unguarded, not practiced, kept her on the line. He told her about the day Eliza left, how she refused to let him be part of Amara's life unless he went public, unless he showed up fully, and how he couldn't, because of board pressure, family leverage, the threat of lawsuits, the cowardice he didn't recognize until it was too late. He didn't beg. He didn't ask for understanding. He just laid it down and let it burn. Amara listened, sometimes through clenched teeth, sometimes in complete silence. Then came the quiet. Not awkward, just full. She closed her eyes, then said the thing that had been clawing at her chest since the moment on the plane. Why didn't you come for me? Her voice shook, but she didn't take it back. Thomas took longer to answer than she expected. I wanted to, he said finally. So many times. But every time I got close, I'd hear your mother's voice in my head telling me not to. That I had already done enough damage. that showing up now would only make it worse. And I believed her, because I was afraid she was right. And if she wasn't, Amara whispered, then I failed you twice. The words sat between them like smoke. Neither of them moved. And then, almost without thinking, Amara said it, soft, unsteady, but real dad. She didn't plan to say it. It just came, and it wrecked him. She could hear it in the way his breath caught. In the silence that followed, stretched too long to be casual. I'm here now, he said, and I'm not going anywhere. She didn't promise anything in return. She wasn't ready for that. But she didn't hang up either, because something in her had cracked, and maybe, just maybe, that was where healing starts. She didn't take the word back. She thought maybe she would. Maybe it had just slipped out. Maybe it wasn't real. But it hung there between them, heavier than anything she'd ever said, and still she didn't pull away. The phone was quiet except for the low static of distance, the kind that makes you painfully aware of how far apart you are from the person on the other end, even when they're trying their hardest to close that gap. I don't know why I said it, Amara admitted, eyes locked on the hotel ceiling. I'm still mad, still confused, but it just came out. You don't owe me the word, Thomas said. His voice was low, a little strained. You don't owe me anything. I know, she said, but I think part of me wanted to know what it would feel like to say it. Not for you, for me. There was a pause. Not defensive, just quiet. Then he asked, and how did it feel? Amara took her time. Strange. Scary. Like I was borrowing something that didn't belong to me. Thomas didn't try to comfort her. He didn't fill the silence with promises or apologies. He let her feel what she needed to feel. And that, more than anything, made her stay on the line. You sound different than I imagined, she said finally. Not just your voice. Everything. I thought if I ever found you, you'd be cold. Calculated. Distant. But you're exhausted, he offered, with a slight laugh that sounded more like breath. She cracked half a smile. Yeah, that too. I've made a lot of mistakes, Amara, he said. Ones I don't expect to be forgiven for. But I'm still here. And if you want, if you're willing, I'd like to be part of your life. On your terms. No expectations. Just presence. Presence. It was such a simple word, but it carried weight. More than any gift, any letter, any photo. Being present meant showing up. And not just once, but consistently. Not just when it was convenient or safe. She didn't say yes. Not out loud. But she didn't hang up either. She let him talk. He asked questions. About her school. Her favorite books. Her grandmother. The little things no one ever thought to ask because they were too busy surviving. And she found herself answering. Not all at once. Not everything. But enough. Enough for him to know she was still listening. Enough for her to realize maybe she didn't have to keep holding her pain like a weapon. Before they ended the call, he asked one more question. Would it be okay if I called you again? Just to talk. She paused, thought about it, then nodded. Even though he couldn't see her, yeah, she said softly. That'd be okay. And then, for the first time in her life, she said goodbye to her father. Not a goodbye that meant ending, but the kind that means we're not done yet. Amara didn't know what she expected from the headquarters of Blake Industries, but whatever it wasn't this. There were no red carpets or grand speeches. Just security guards who gave her a second glance like they weren't sure if she was lost or in the wrong building, and employees who passed by with polite indifference, never once guessing that the girl standing quietly next to Thomas Blake might have been his daughter. Not officially, not legally, not publicly, but the blood didn't lie, and neither did the quiet way he kept glancing at her, like he still couldn't believe she was really there. He led her through a side corridor, not the main entrance, and she knew why. This visit wasn't scheduled. It wasn't in the press. It wasn't meant to be seen. Just like she hadn't been all these years. He'd chosen discretion, chosen silence, chosen to protect the image, the brand, the billion-dollar empire with his name on every wall, except hers. They stopped in front of a large double door. Inside was a private gallery room, the kind used for board events and photo ops. She saw it before he said anything. The portrait, her mother, Eliza, young, radiant, full of life in a way Amara had never seen her. The painting had been commissioned years ago, a private work never displayed. hidden behind layers of reputation and regret. She never knew I had it made, Thomas said quietly. I had it done after she left. I couldn't put it anywhere people would ask questions. Amara stared at the painting. The soft lines, the confident gaze, the subtle curve of a smile that had always felt like a myth in her memory. It was Eliza, but it was also someone Amara had never been allowed to know. The girl in the painting looked like someone who had once believed in love, before fear stole everything from her. She should have been in your story, Amara said, not just behind closed doors. I know. And me? He didn't answer right away. You would have cost me everything, he admitted. Not just money, but power, control, a clean reputation. I had investors who warned me, board members who threatened to resign, a black child out of wedlock, with a mother who had a mental health record. They said it would ruin me. Amara didn't flinch. She already knew. She'd seen it in the way people looked at her, the way people didn't look at her whole life. But hearing it from him, that it wasn't just fear or shame, it was strategy that stung. You let them erase me, she said, steady but sharp. You build an empire on hiding people like me. No, he said. I built it on hiding myself. That landed harder than she expected. She walked slowly toward the portrait, stopped just short of it. Her reflection ghosted across the glass. For a second, her face overlapped with her mother's. Different eras, same eyes, same silence. I should hate you, she said, not looking at him. I wouldn't blame you, but I don't. I don't even know if I want anything from you. Not your name, not your money, not your legacy. You don't have to want any of it, but I do want the truth. All of it, and not just for me. Thomas stepped forward. There are files, documents, records of how they try to make you disappear, through silence, through lawyers, through pressure. You weren't invisible. They made you invisible, and you let them. I did. Amara turned to face him. Then you help me change that. Not for your image, not because you feel guilty, but because I exist, and I'm done pretending I don't. Thomas nodded. Then let's start there. Not with forgiveness, not with inheritance, but with acknowledgement. They didn't tell the board she was coming. Thomas didn't think it was necessary. Amara knew better. It wasn't about logistics. It was about control. If there was anything she had learned from the last few weeks, it was that powerful people don't like unexpected guests, especially when those guests come bearing the kind of truth that can't be rewritten in a press release. So when she walked into that boardroom, tight-lipped, spine straight, backpack still slung over her shoulder, every person at that table turned to look, not with curiosity, but with calculation. There were 12 of them. 11 men. 1 woman. Suits sharp enough to cut. Smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Most of them older. Most of them white. All of them used to the world running on their terms. None of them knew who she was. Not really, but they knew enough to be uncomfortable. This is Amara, Thomas said, his voice calm, measured, but with a quiet edge no one missed. She's my daughter. No one spoke. No one moved. The woman in the corner glanced at her tablet, as if hoping the screen would offer an escape. Amara stepped forward. She didn't wait for permission. You don't need to ask if it's true. You already knew someone existed. You just didn't want to know her name. One of the older board members shifted in his chair. Mr. Blake, is this... It's not a scandal, Thomas cut in without raising his voice. It's a truth I buried, one I won't keep hiding. Another board member, younger, leaned forward. And what is it you want, miss? Weaver, Amara said, and I don't want anything. Not from you. That threw them. They were expecting a lawsuit, a claim, a grab for something. But she wasn't there for that. She was there to be seen, to exist. What I want, she continued, is to understand how a group of people so concerned with reputation could sit around this table for years and never once ask what it costs to erase someone. The question hung heavy that no one answered, because there was no answer that didn't reveal everything wrong with the system they helped protect. I was never part of your conversations, she said, but I was part of his life, even if he pretended I wasn't. And now I'm here, not to beg, not to forgive, just to make sure you remember. Thomas didn't interrupt her once, didn't step in, didn't soften anything to let her speak, because it wasn't about him anymore. When she finished, she turned to him. I don't want a seat at that table, she said, but I am part of the story, so don't let them write me out again. Thomas looked at the board. then back at her. "You have my word," he said. IT wasn't enough, but it was a beginning, and for now, that was all she needed. The room was quiet when she returned. Not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, but the kind that carries weight. The kind that sits on your chest while you try to breathe through everything you just learned. Amara didn't turn on the TV, didn't scroll her phone, didn't even bother unpacking. She sat at the small desk in the corner with her backpack beside her, the same one she'd carried through every airport, every office, every conversation that cracked her open a little more. She took out the photo, the letter from her mom, the one from Thomas, and then, slowly, she pulled out a blank piece of hotel stationery and uncapped her pen. She stared at it for a long time before she wrote the first word. "Me, am I just that? Not dear, not grandma, not with love. Just her name. Because that's what this letter needed. Truth, not comfort. I've been angry for a long time. Longer than I even realized. And not just at him. At you. For not telling me. For letting me believe a version of my life that was easier to carry but harder to live inside." Her hand didn't shake. She didn't cry. The words came slow but steady, like a wound that had finally decided to drain. "I know you thought you were protecting me. I know you didn't do it to be cruel. But not telling the truth is still a kind of betrayal. Silence, I've learned, can be just as loud as lies." She paused, let that sit. "I met him. Thomas. He told me what happened. His part, at least. I'm not excusing it. I'm not forgetting it. I'm definitely not forgiving it. Not yet. But I also don't hate him. And that might be the most terrifying part." She exhaled. That was the line she'd needed to write. The one that made everything else real. "I don't want to spend my life holding on to someone else's cowardice like it's my inheritance. I don't want bitterness to be the thing I pass down if I ever have a daughter of my own." She swallowed hard, her eyes suddenly hot. "So, I'm not saying I forgive him, but I'm saying I'm learning how not to hate him. I think that's a start." Her pen hovered, then pressed again. "And I'm writing to you because I need you to know this isn't just about him. It's about us. I love you. I always will. But I need you to stop protecting me from the truth. I can handle it. I've had to." She folded the letter slowly, placed it into an envelope, and wrote Mimi across the front. She didn't know when she'd hand it to her. Maybe she'd leave it on the kitchen table back home. Maybe she'd read it aloud. Maybe she'd never give it to her at all. But it had to be written, because Amara was done letting everyone else decide what she needed to know. Done carrying other people's secrets like they were her burden to bear. Forgiveness wasn't a gift she was giving them. It was the freedom she was giving herself. She didn't sleep that night. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, she was awake to her own choices. There was no clarity, no perfect moment of peace, but there was stillness. The kind that comes after the storm has passed, when the air smells different and you know everything's changed, even if it doesn't look like it yet. The letter sat on the desk in front of her. She hadn't sealed it. Maybe she would. Maybe she wouldn't. What mattered was that she had written it. That the words had come from her, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but from a place deeper than either. A place she hadn't known how to reach until now. By morning, she knew she didn't want to run anymore. Not from her mother's absence, or Thomas's silence, or Mimi's quiet protection that had started to feel like a wall. She wanted to live her life with the truth, not in spite of it. That meant facing things that were still messy, still painful. It meant letting people in without giving them control. It meant figuring out how to hold both hurt and love in the same hand and not letting one cancel out the other. So she called Thomas, not to rehash anything, not to ask more questions, just to say she was flying home and that she wasn't closing the door. He didn't ask for more. He didn't try to convince her of anything. He just said, "Okay, safe flight." That was enough. The airport felt smaller this time. Not physically, but in her mind. It used to feel like a place full of exits and unknowns. Now it felt like transition, like a space between two versions of herself. The girl who didn't know and the girl who did. When she landed, Mimi was waiting. No signs, no hugs, just her standing near baggage claim like she had every time before. Her hands looked older, her eyes more tired. But the moment Amara walked toward her, Mimi stepped forward and said, You read the letter. Amara nodded. I wrote one too. Mimi didn't reach for it. She didn't ask to read it. She just said, let's go home. In the car, they didn't talk. But the silence wasn't heavy this time. It was full of permission. That night, Amara sat with Mimi on the back porch. Same swing, same creak, same view she'd stared at since she was little. This time, when Mimi asked, you want to talk about it? Amara said yes, and she told her everything. Not with anger, not with blame, just truth, because sometimes healing isn't loud. Sometimes it sounds like two women across two generations finally deciding not to lie to each other anymore. It had been exactly 34 days since Amara left London. She counted, not out of habit, but because something about keeping track made her feel in control. In 34 days, she had told the truth out loud, stood her ground in a boardroom full of people who once erased her, and sat with her grandmother long enough for silence to turn into something like understanding. Mimi's health had started to slip quietly, the way old trees begin to lean without falling. There was no dramatic hospital scene, no final goodbye, just slow afternoons, weaker hands, and a look in her grandmother's eyes that said, you're ready now, even if I won't be here to see it all. Amara wasn't sure if she agreed, but she didn't argue. Sometimes love meant not asking for more time. When the day came to leave again, she packed slowly. There wasn't much to take back. Some letters, a bracelet, a photo tucked in her wallet. But the real weight stayed behind, folded into memories and rooms she might not walk through again. Mimi walked her to the porch. No words, just the same swing, the same slowness, the same final kind of comfort. Like a tea at the airport, Amara moved through security like muscle memory. She didn't feel 17. She didn't feel grown, but she felt solid, like someone who had earned her name. And then she saw her. IT didn't make sense that IT didn't have to. There, standing near the gate, was her mother. Older, thinner, but unmistakably Eliza. She wasn't ghostly or radiant or fragile. She was just there, real, solid, like she had been stitched back into the fabric of Amara's life without warning. Neither of them moved for a second. They just looked. Then Eliza took a shaky step forward. I didn't know if I had the right, she said, voice trembling. Amara didn't answer with words. She dropped her bag. She stepped in, and she hugged her. Not tight, not dramatic, just long enough for it to feel real, long enough for the silence to say everything words couldn't. And then Thomas appeared, walking slowly behind, hesitant like a man who'd been granted a second chance and didn't know where to begin using it. He stopped a few feet away, unsure. Amara reached for his hand. She pulled him in 2.3 people. One embrace. Nothing perfect, nothing fixed, but everything possible. Because healing doesn't come all at once. It arrives in fragments, in the courage to show up, in the grace to stay, in the moment someone stops running and chooses to be seen. That sunset didn't solve everything that IT didn't need to. IT just closed one story and quietly opened another. And that finally was enough. If this story moved you, even a little, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what it means to be human. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if someone from your past returned with the truth? Would you run? Or would you listen? Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the ending we get isn't the one we asked for, but it's the one we needed. The end.